All righty. Good news. We are live on YouTube. So if you're just joining us, normally we take a break in the middle of class to eat, but tonight we had some pizza that had been ordered, and so we decided to go ahead and eat first. So you didn't miss anything if you're just seeing us now. A lot of you will go back and watch this later, so it won't matter either way. Couple of announcement type things related to the school. So you see on our slide here that for the last, quarter century or so, I imagine this has been the Georgia School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. It is the GSOP no more. As of last week, this is known as the Citadel Bible Institute. And there's a few reasons for that change. Number one, the school had outgrown that title, I think, School of Preaching and Biblical Studies. It's more than that. There are campuses in other states, and so they wanted to change that. Also, with the launching of the Citadel, not to be confused with the Citadel University, but there is an on-campus element to GSOP. So the Marietta campus will have daily classes, and folks can move to Marietta, stay for a 2-year program, just like they do in Memphis, just like they do in Knoxville, just like they do in Warner Robins and other places across the country. And so you'll see over the next little while some logo type things. And actually, I can probably pull up just sort of a review if you are here for the first time or just joined. We started with a timeline of the events of this book, and we went all the way back to 722 BC with the Assyrians conquering Israel, and that's going to be into tonight as well a little bit. The Babylonians conquered Judah in 587 or 586 BCE, depending which year you take. The first remnant of about 50,000 returns with Zerubbabel and start their work on the temple. And then, of course, in 516, 20 years later, the temple rebuild is completed. In 478, Esther becomes the queen of Persia. We'll look at her, in a couple of weeks. And then in 458, Ezra leads a smaller group back from Babylon. This is for spiritual and moral reforms. And then where we are here, in about 444 or 445, Nehemiah, the cupbearer of Artaxerxes, returns to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. So this is sort of a timeline for you to think about. And obviously, this is very ancient history. This is a long time ago, but these are the events that we are into. We talked about the book of Ezra. We talked about some of the kings. And of course, the most important king in this narrative, in my mind, is King Cyrus. This is Cyrus the Great. Of course, he conquered the Median Empire and the Babylonians. He died. Whether it was in battle or whether it was at home, there's a lot of different stories about his death. Of course, the legend of a great king. But he issued the Edict of Restoration, which allowed the return. Ezra says he was inspired by the Lord. He's mentioned in Isaiah as well as the book of Ezra. And then, of course, in 1879, we discovered the cylinder of Cyrus the Great, which gives us a lot of history of who he was and the world and some of his style of reform. Then we looked at Jeremiah chapter 29, where it prophesied the return from exile. And if you remember, we talked about the timing of this, right? The 70 years and what that kind of meant. So just kind of be mindful of that discussion. And then we talked about, over the past couple of weeks, the book of Ezra. We talked about the 3 Jewish feasts, of course, the Passover feast, Pentecost, and the Feast of the Tabernacles. We talked about the work of these 2 guys. We looked at Ezra chapter 3 and the laying of the foundation of the temple. We talked about King Esarhaddon of Assyria. We talked about Sennacherib who, of course, is very, very important in 2 Kings 18 and 19 and his opposition to Hezekiah. Anybody, by the way, remember what happened to Sennacherib when he challenged Hezekiah? It was just last week, so hopefully you remember it. He had an army of 180,000 people that were camped outside Jerusalem, and what became of them? Yeah, they were all killed, and Sennacherib went home to his temple to worship his God, and what happened to him there? Death is involved for sure. How did he die? He was killed by two of his sons. Yep, he was killed by two of his sons. That's right. That's a good way to remember it. Steak. I like that. And then his son here, Esarhaddon, who was not supposed to be the king, became the king of Assyria. And in Ezra, it talks about how he started the process of moving people around the kingdom. We looked briefly last week at Haggai and Zechariah. We watched the videos on them. And we had this little timeline of the Persian kings. Cyrus the Great is actually Cyrus the Second. He was the founder of the Persian Empire. And of course, we talked about that today. What modern day nation traces its history back to being the founder of the Persian Empire? Yeah, Iran traces itself back to being part of the Persian Empire. We looked at Cambyses II, who conquered Egypt during his reign, and then who I believe is the greatest of these kings, maybe not the most well-known, but the greatest of them is Darius the First, or Darius the Great. He ruled the Persian Empire at its peak. Second temple is completed during his reign. Then we looked at Xerxes. And then, of course, tonight we'll talk about Artaxerxes. We just started, Mark. You got here just in time. Mark has been playing in a mud puddle all day. Can you believe that? You were playing the role of a badger today, weren't you? Or building a dam to stop the water? Somebody said that you'd have to, it's kind of crazy if a badger just sees a body of water and goes, absolutely not. That's not going to flow through here. And they go and build a dam anyway. Beaver, yeah, what did I say? Oh, I was thinking about football. A beaver, yeah, it's not a badger. Yeah, beavers. All right. So we talked about these kings, and tonight we're going to deal with this guy specifically, who reigned from 465 to 425, and he is King Artaxerxes. Ezra chapter 7, we talked about a little bit his letter to Artaxerxes, the journey from Persia or Babylon back to Jerusalem. It's a 900-mile journey. I think it's pretty amazing when you think about the entirety of this story. 900 miles. I don't know. Where could you go from here that's 900 miles? Oh, you made that drive before, huh? Okay. So Houston, Texas is not that far away, right? You can drive. Oh, that's right. You said it's 14 hours last week? If you drive it straight. How long is that on an airplane, you think? Yeah, not very far, right? You literally could be standing right here where we are, drive to the airport an hour and a half, get on a plane, and in 4 hours, you could be 900 miles from here. Well, it wasn't so easy for these folks, right? It took them 4 months to make this journey where they were trying to go. And this is where we left off last week. And I want to pick up here because I asked you to think about this question. Whether or not, well, let's review here where we're going back. Okay, so why was in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, why was intermarriage forbidden with other nations? Okay, for idolatry. There are a lot of people that look back at this with modern eyes, right? And they're offended because it comes across as race warfare, as bigotry, as all these things that it's not. Because one of the things that we take for granted is that each nation during this time had its own God. And so when you allowed yourself to marry into a foreign nation or marry a man or woman that was foreign, you committed yourselves essentially to their God, right? That happens in lesser ways now, right? I don't know, when we were teenagers, they called it flirt to convert, right? You started dating a girl that went to some other church or a guy that went to some other church just to bring them around, right, and straighten them out. Some of you are a product of that. You went to a different kind of church and came in and, whoever you married taught you the truth and you changed your mind and joined, right? So that's one of the things that happens. That's a parent's worst nightmare, right? You bring a boyfriend or girlfriend home and they're of this faith or this faith. I'll never forget when I was a senior in high school, the Methodist Church moves its preachers around, every so often. And so at the Methodist church in town, there was a new preacher and he had a good looking daughter. And so I asked her out and I went to pick her up for the first date and went in and met her dad. And what do you think the first question he asked was? Where do you go to church? And, well, he asked me if I went to church and I said yes. And he got excited. And then I told him where and you could just see his face. Right? So we ended up talking about the Bible for about an hour before we went to the movies, and he was a good guy, but shockingly, that relationship did not work out. But it's important in this discussion because it was specifically prohibited by God in multiple places, and so when they chose to violate that and to intermarry with foreign wives, they were violating a strict law of God, and so Ezra commands the people to send their foreign wives away. And so I left you with this question last week does this have any bearing or what is the bearing on the New Testament teaching about marriage and divorce? And I'll tell you why I asked that question, because I sort of heard my whole life growing up this justification that if you find yourself in an improper marriage, then you are to send your wife away or your husband away, just like Ezra did here in Ezra chapter 9. And so I just kind of want to throw that out there. Do you think that's a fair comparison, or what do you think? It's an interesting thought.
Jeremy, the interesting component of that is they also had to send the children away.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know that we can glean from that much bearing on New Testament teaching, because I don't see anybody who's enforcing that.
Yeah. Be hard to do. Other thoughts?
I was engaged to my high school sweetheart of many years, 3, 4.
I'm going to say, how many years were you in high school if it was a many year?
He was older than me.
Oh, okay.
He was in college.
I got you.
I was back in Florida. And it was like 2 years when I decided to go to the Lord's church.
Yeah.
And he was a Nazarene. And so I tried to teach him the truth. He probably would have gone along with it, but I had parents.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up breaking up, which was good because I would have paid for her lesson or probably.
Mm-hmm.
But it was rough because once I accepted the truth, nothing else would do.
Yeah.
And he really was fine with that, but his mother wasn't.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so that's a hard situation, right? And I think it goes to an interesting point. So leave your Bibles open there, but then turn over to 1 Corinthians with me. And then when you get to 1 Corinthians, turn to 2 Corinthians. I knew that wasn't right when I looked at it. 2 Corinthians, chapter 6. Chapter 6. So I want to throw this out there. If we're going to use this story to teach about marriage, I think we need to use it as a preventative teaching rather than a teaching about divorce and remarriage. And let me just say this. We're not going to litigate all the different controversies about marriage, divorce, and remarriage tonight. Not interested in that. I think we have to be careful, though, if we're using things that don't necessarily, they don't relate in any way to New Testament teaching as a principle for what to do, because the Bible doesn't spell certain solutions out very clearly. I do think, though, where this is explicitly useful is here in 2 Corinthians 6, and this reminder to us about choosing a partner. And right above 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14, does anybody have like a subheading or a subtitle, I should say? Okay, be holy. Anybody else have anything different?
Where are you talking about?
Right above 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14.
Warning against idolatry.
Warning against idolatry. Now, isn't that interesting? Because isn't that the problem in Ezra? that they are worshiping false gods with their foreign wives?
Mine says the temple of the living God.
Okay, well, it's going to get to that at the end. No, you're in 1 Corinthians, I think.
No, mine says AI.
Okay. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Barry, read verses 14 through 16.
Do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As
Okay.
God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people.
Okay. So that's why it says we are the temple of God. Yeah. So let me ask this question. Are people that are unbelievers inherently wicked?
I don't know about that.
Okay. You might want to disagree.
I do,
Okay, go ahead.
because even at birth, children do things that are inappropriate.
Yeah. I was going with you till then. You lost me.
Well, they do things that they haven't learned.
Yeah. Okay.
Because they follow other people, and sometimes being bookers is natural.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. So that's not where I was going. So let me clarify a couple things. Number one, I think the doctrine of original sin is completely false and has no support in the Bible. The idea that we are born sinful, that's not where we're going. What I'm thinking is this. If I am not a Christian, if the blood of Jesus has not washed my sins away, what is my spiritual state? Lost and covered in sins. If I am a non-believer, that I've never had my sins washed away, then every sin I've ever committed is imputed to me, and I wear it. So let me ask you then, if I'm covered in every sin that I've ever committed, am I inherently wicked? Absolutely, I am. Now, does that mean that Christians are better than other people? No, but it means that we have connected with the power of the sacrifice of Jesus and have been cleansed and purified. And so because of his holiness and his righteousness, we are cleansed, right? We are light, right? We're righteousness, we're perfection, all those things. And unbelievers are by their very nature of not being cleansed, they are wicked and they are darkness.
I think an issue with children is what they do or choose to do is often because they haven't been taught what they should do and what they shouldn't do. And so that's why I'm saying,
Yeah.
I don't think they're inherently evil until they know something's wrong and they choose to do it.
Yeah.
Then they become,
Yeah.
okay? But before a child knows what's wrong, most children are self-absorbed.
Yeah.
I mean, they can be the best of friends and all of a sudden one day, wait,
Yeah.
at a very young age.
Well, listen, I don't think that stops in children, does it? I mean, all of us are the exact same way.
That's just your natural response
Yeah.
to being challenged. But as you grow and you're taught, you'll just automatically stop something in the mouth.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I like the NASB translation of that word. Instead of wickedness, it has lawlessness. And I think that goes along with what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the law of Christ is what changes us. And so, in contrast, somebody who's not yet under that law hasn't put themselves in subjection to Christ.
Yeah.
That's the difference. I agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you make of verse 14? So I remember as a kid sitting in the pew and you know, lots of great preachers, you know, sitting and saying, do not be yoked together. I think, as a matter of fact, the King James and the New King James say, don't be unequally yoked or something like that, you know. So what does that mean? Don't be unequally yoked.
Well, if you were raised on farm,
Mm-hmm.
it means you're under a piece of wood with somebody right next to you, and you have no way of getting out of it. And so whoever's behind you driving with the whip or whatever, you are forced to go. And you learn pretty quickly that if you both work together, you get away from the whips.
Yeah. So do you think that he's just meaning marriage in this context?
Friendship.
Yeah, I think this is any relationship, right? Does that mean that you can't be friends with unbelievers? Of course not. But it has to do, in my mind, with a level of influence. So let me ask you this question. I'm not going to go to the point to say that it's sinful, although a lot of preachers before me have said this. Is it a smart idea to be in a relationship, or certainly to marry someone who's an unbeliever?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
When my kids coming up, we had classes that said it's the danger of you marrying somebody that's not a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
You never hear that anymore. I wonder if we took these teenagers that are here now and asked them if there was any difference in marrying somebody that's not a Christian. I bet you there's not 5 of them.
Well, we talk about it in the teen class, but I think probably their outlooks on it have changed. Yeah, absolutely.
Because you know what, a good thing is that I know of them 3 families, and none of them, they married Christians. And all of them have kids, and not one of them are members of the church.
Yeah. Listen, I can tell you my
So
yeah.
important.
I can tell you my experience when I met my wife. We're on YouTube, so I won't use her name. But when I met my wife, you might be surprised, but when I laid eyes on her the first time, the first question I asked her was not where she went to church. Y'all believe that? We were 21, and I saw her, and my eyes about bugged out of my head the first time, and it was a long time before we had a conversation about where she went to church. So let's be honest with each other about those things, right? But when that conversation came up, it was something that we had to talk about, and we dated for a long time and studied for a long time, and she made the decision on her own without my influence to become a Christian after study, and I was very proud of her, and I was able to baptize her, and that's something that nobody will ever be able to take away from us in our relationship. It was a cool thing. But had she not become a Christian, I would not have married her, because I didn't want to be in that position, you know, and not just because of aspirations for ministry, but just because of how terrible that would be. Now, does that mean it's impossible for someone who's married to a non-Christian to influence them? Of course not. Yeah, but it makes life more difficult.
Jeremy, it's not a one-to-one exactly, but when we're talking about this, I'm reminded of 1 Corinthians 7, near the end of the chapter, where it talks about the wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry him whom she wishes. But then it adds this preface at the end, only in the Lord. Now, there's a lot of different people have different ideas about what that in the Lord means. I'm personally in the camp that means they're supposed to remarry a Christian when their spouse passes away.
Yeah.
That's just my persuasion on that verse. There's other people have different
Yeah.
ideas.
Chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians is a hard one. It's one of the few chapters of the Bible that I think you have to study in a vacuum. But certainly, if we're just talking about wise choices, right? Also, you should always marry someone who shares your faith and your belief. And I'm not one that's going to take it to the point and say it's sinful not to do so. But I think our discussion here in Ezra, and then, a counter, or at least in the New Testament, a mirroring idea, this idea that you shouldn't be yoked together with people who don't share your faith, reminds us of the importance of sharing that marriage relationship with someone who is just as interested in our soul as they are in our body, and just as interested in eternal life as they are in this life. We might share the same goals with somebody as it relates to family and children and where you want to live and where you want to send the kids to school and all that. But if our faith doesn't align, it's going to be very, very difficult to have a successful marriage. Now, there are lots of counter examples to this, right? I know lots of folks that were married into their 60s and found Christ, and that's great and that's wonderful. And I think about you guys and the Littles who were baptized together as husband and wife on the same, and that's an awesome thing. And so I would never discourage that, and we should always be teaching people. But I think about, for our teenagers and for our young adults, reminding them how much pain and heartache and sorrow they can avoid by making a wise choice, and and difficulty. And so I think for us, when we're thinking about marriage and this story in Ezra, that's the direction that we ought to take it. The very hard conversations about divorce and remarriage, I think we open up to the words of Christ, and we open up to the words of New Testament, rather than saying, hey, let's open our Bibles back to Ezra, because it's really hard to help people understand things that don't directly relate to what we're talking about. That's just my opinion, my 2 cents. Anybody want to add anything to that? Any of you elders or former elder want to say anything about that? All right. Unless anybody else has anything, let's open the book of Nehemiah.
Actually, I do have something to say.
Okay.
If Kate and I had not both been Christians before we met, I don't think you would have ever tried to win my favor. And if we had not been Christians, we would not be here.
Yeah.
We would not have had lessons. We would not have had brotherhood. And we would not both be enjoying.
Yeah.
So the bind of what we both accepted as God's word has physically, literally, emotionally kept us together because of our spiritual commitment to God.
Yeah. Listen, I've had that same conversation with so many people who have said that. And I think that if you hear it, it sounds bad, but if we weren't Christians, I wouldn't still be married to my spouse. And you go, man, y'all really hate each other that much? I don't think it's that, although some days, right, for you married people, but I don't think it's that. I think what it is the word you used is that when we made a commitment to our spouse, we also made a commitment to the Lord to work through that. And, for people that don't have faith, that's not as serious. And I think that's something that, once again, we teach our young people.
And for me, it wasn't hate. It wasn't the opposite of love. It was indifference.
Yeah.
Which I think is more serious in a relationship than hate or love.
Tate looks like he's hearing this for the first time. Yeah. How long have y'all been married? 44 years. Pop, how long have y'all been married? 67 years. Well, that's all right. John, how about y'all? 60. This was your 60th?
Yeah.
When was their anniversary? Oh, did we celebrate it?
Good answer.
Man. Yeah, he knew the day, and they've been married 60 years. Well, congratulations. Man, that's awesome. 60 years. Pop, if y'all make it to 70 years, we'll have to have a big party. That's rare. What I know Jimmy Carter passed away recently. How long were he and his wife married? Wasn't it something like 75 years they were married? That's amazing. Well, you don't know what kind of commitment you're getting into when you marry somebody. 72 years. Oh, there you go. Mark, how long have y'all been married? Be 40 in December. Wow, that's amazing. Didn't both of y'all get married on Christmas? Y'all were Christmas Day? I still say it's because you was too cheap to buy Christmas presents and wedding, but yeah. Oh, that's right. Man, you lucked out. All right. Book of Nehemiah. Who knows what the name Nehemiah means? No, not wall builder, although that certainly is his title. It means God comforts or comforted by God. And I think that goes along with some of the thoughts here. So the key verse, of course, in the book of Nehemiah, the one that we all know, is from Nehemiah chapter 4 and verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. And depending on which translation you have, it may say one of two things. For the people worked with all their heart, or what's the other version of that? The people had what? A mind to work. We're going to talk more about that when we get over to chapter 4. I like the translation, they worked with all their heart. I'll tell you why later on. So let's talk about this guy, King Artaxerxes. What do we know about him? Well, we can say a few things, and you have some space there to take notes if you want to. He was the king of Persia from 465 to 425 BC. So he had a reign of 40 years. And the events that we're discussing here in Nehemiah take place right in the middle of his reign, about 445 or 444 BCE, depending on which how you deal or don't deal with 1 year. He was the youngest son of King Xerxes and his wife Amestris. Interestingly, who would Artaxerxes' stepmother have been? Queen Esther. Isn't that interesting? Now, I don't think that the stepmother relationship that we think about today was existing then. He probably didn't live in a house with her. She probably didn't raise him. They probably didn't have a ton of interaction, but it is interesting that they would have been in the same family. Of course, ancient kings had multiple wives. We know that Xerxes was also married to what other woman in the book of Esther? Anybody remember the queen in Esther before Esther? Queen Vashti. Look at Natalie getting all the bonus points tonight. Queen Vashti, being a preacher's wife. So he was raised to the throne, interestingly, by the man who murdered his father. And then he killed him himself. So Xerxes is killed, and then Artaxerxes kills the man who kills his father in a hand-to-hand fight. And he deals with a bunch of insurrections. So the beginning of his kingship is full of fights. There's a revolt in Egypt. There's a revolt here, revolt there. And so he's always trying to squash some of these. In the Egyptian rebellion, he gets help from the Athenians, which of course we know that's going to be short-lived because it'll be Greece who conquers them. So he's dealing with all these battles and all these wars, but eventually he comes to be a very stable king. After he gets those power struggles out of the way at the beginning, he becomes a very peaceful king, a very successful king, and he rules for quite a long time. And he has someone in his company named Nehemiah. Nehemiah, of course, we said means comforted by God, and Nehemiah was a cupbearer. So what was a cupbearer in ancient times?
Someone that tasted what was in the cup before they gave it to the king.
Right. Yes. So I think there's a literal job and more. There's an official job and there's more of an unofficial job. So the official responsibility is to be the king's taste tester. So I want you to know that I served as a cupbearer for you guys today. when I got here with the pizza, I tasted a piece of the sausage pizza. And that way, if you would have gotten here and I was dead, you would have known it was the pizza that did it, right? But that was literally his job. One of the ways that many people in ancient society were killed was poison, right? You've got your ancient Mountain Dew wine there, and somebody puts something in it, and you drink it, and you're dead. A lot of famous people in antiquity, you read about their death, and it says they were poisoned. So it was the cupbearer's job to prevent that from happening. So the cupbearer sampled the wine, took care of the things that the king was going to eat so that they would not die. There's something that I read in one of the commentaries, I don't remember which one, that said Nehemiah was probably a eunuch. Now, I'm not sure if I'm ready to go along with that, but I understand the logic, because if the cupbearer the cupbearer was arguably the closest person to the king. They took care of their food. They were always in their presence. They were there at mealtime. And so they certainly would have interacted with the king's harem. They would have interacted with the queen. And so this idea that many cupbearers were eunuchs is logical. We don't necessarily have any clear indication of that, but Nehemiah could have been a eunuch. The cupbearer, though, often the title and the job were what they were, but it also was an honorary position. And in a lot of societies, the cupbearer was one of the most important officials in a nation. Do you remember another time in our Bibles where we see a cupbearer for someone be discussed in the Bible?
Joseph's narrative.
Yeah, talk about that for a second. Where's a cupbearer?
So he was, thrown into prison.
Mm-hmm.
Wasn't found to be trustworthy. Of course, they have the dreams and come to Joseph, and he was the baker at him, and eventually he was cleared. I believe was he the one that was cleared, or was it I think he was cleared.
Yeah.
He goes back and he forgets obviously to tell what Joseph had.
Yes. Yeah, and this is in Genesis chapter 40, I believe, 40 and 41. Let me double check. Yes, the cupbearer and the baker in Genesis chapter 40. And in verse 23 of chapter 40, it says, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. And of course, Joseph sits in jail for another 2 years after that. Yeah. So the cupbearer to Pharaoh. And, this is an important job. And so Nehemiah is not just a guy who works for the king. He has a very important political position. And so let me do that. Spencer, will you do me a giant favor? Will you go in my office and grab the computer charger? Because if not, all this is about to go away. The code's 3794 to get in there. And it's in my backpack. You don't really have to run. Okay, he's running. But he's very literal. So let's dive into the text a little bit. Nehemiah chapter 1. Let's turn back over there. So Nehemiah here is the narrator. The words were probably written down by Ezra, but these are the words of Nehemiah. He tells in the beginning of the chapter of Hanani, one of his brothers, who comes to visit. He says, I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. So some of your versions, yes, perfect. Some of your versions may say something different than survive the exile there. What do some of your versions say? Not survive the exile, but what? Anybody's version say they escaped? Yeah, so that's an interesting thought. Escaped. Let's see, we got to figure something out. Y'all are right about the TVs that you have the notes in front of you. We're going to seal this essentially. All righty. We have power. All right. So he says there, escaped. So some people have taken this to mean people that escaped the actual invasion of Babylon. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think he's talking about the people that left Babylon with Zerubbabel in the first group to return. And so that's just kind of something to note there. He said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province. What province is he talking about? We mentioned this last week. When he says province, what does he mean? Well, Jerusalem is where they're at, but what Persian province did we say here was what was there at the time? We said it was Trans-Euphrates, or no, beyond the river is what some places called it. So the NIV calls it Trans-Euphrates. This would have been a large Persian province. He says they're back in the province. They're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. And he says, when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And in chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, we get a picture here of Nehemiah's relationship with the Lord, because we have his prayer written down. It is a prayer of humility and a prayer of admitting wrongdoing and sin. But it is a prayer to be able to return home. And then he says there in verse 11, I was cupbearer to the king. And so we get that title. Couple of things about the prayer just to point out. I don't want to go in too much detail. But he says, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. So I think it's interesting there. He starts off with the acknowledgement of who God is, but to me, he's saying, Lord, I beg you to hear what I'm about to say. And I think that's interesting wording there. That, Lord, please listen to what I say. And he confesses his sin, but he says in verse 10, they are your servants and your people whom you redeem by your great strength and your mighty hand. And he says again, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant, to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. And so he asks God, I want you to give me success in this mission that I'm about to undertake. And the mission here in chapter 2 is the request to the king. So now put yourself in Nehemiah's shoes for a second. Or his sandals. Put yourself in Nehemiah's sandals for a second. That was a lot funnier joke. Y'all should have laughed. Put yourself in his position, right? So you are from a foreign nation. You don't belong to the Persians at all. As a matter of fact, you were from Jewish heritage, and then you were Babylonian, and now you're Persian just by virtue of the conquest. And instead of being a slave or a servant, you serve in a high position of prominence and importance as the cupbearer of the king. You are there, you share meals with the king. And as we read here in this text, not only the king, but he finds favor with the queen as well, because when he approaches Artaxerxes, the queen is seated right beside him. He's an important official. Listen, Artaxerxes trusts Nehemiah with his life. If anybody wanted to kill Artaxerxes, it would be Nehemiah, who they would go to put the poison in his wine or in his food. And also, if you remember from the story of Esther, do you just go up to the king and start asking things? No, what do? Yeah, you make an appointment, or you make an official request, or your very life is on the line. Esther thought that she was going to be killed for approaching her own husband. And so they're there at dinner. In verse 1, it says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when the wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. And so the king recognizes him. And what's the next statement that he makes there at the end of verse 2? What does he say?
So I became dreadful
Yeah, he said, I became dreadfully afraid. The NIV says, I was very much afraid. And I love this verse. And this has been a sermon idea floating around a little bit. What's the word after I was very afraid? But. I don't know what your version says. The NIV says but. Yeah. Isn't that a cool idea for a sermon? I was very afraid, but. Conquering our fear, right? Don't be stealing it, Spencer. I see your eyes lighting up back there. I'm gonna see it Monday on YouTube. A Spencer Hall clip. No, I was very afraid, but instead he says, I said to the king, may the king live forever. It's a good start, Nehemiah. Why should my face not look sad where the city my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And so he makes the request. Verse 6 says, then the king with the queen sitting beside him asked me, how long will your journey take and when will you get back? To me, that's so interesting that it's not even a question of if he's going to approve it. He says, how long will your journey take and when will you be back? To me, that shows mutual admiration, mutual respect, and mutual affection, right, between the king and his cupbearer. Then Nehemiah gets brave, right? I also said to him, if it pleases the king, can I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, which is the province, so that they will provide me safe conduct till I arrive in Judah? And may I have a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. Because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. So it's a good story so far. Nehemiah, he visits with his brother, and I think it means his physical brother. In chapter 1, he hears about Jerusalem, so he mourns. He prays to God. He goes before the king. The king grants him his request. He's going to go back home and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But then, like any good story, the villains show up, right? And here we have three very specific villains who are going to plague Nehemiah throughout the book. And they are, anybody want to guess their names? Sanballat or Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arab. These are going to be the three people who cause so much problems. So it says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Now, why? Why would this be a problem for these two guys in particular? What do you think? Why would they care that he's rebuilding Jerusalem? I mean, who are these guys, right? Okay, so this first one here is not only a Samaritan, but he is the governor or the leader of Samaria, and he is actually mentioned in an ancient artifact that was discovered. I'm trying to see when it was. It was discovered in 1907, and talks about him and about the governors of Samaria. And so he goes on to be a really important villain and enemy of Egypt. And as a matter of fact, he is going to be in charge of building his own temple, modeled after the temple in Jerusalem. And so he is very much an enemy of Nehemiah and of the rebuilding. The title Horonite is one that, based on where you read, it's discussed. A lot of rumors about what that means. Some people say it was a city in Moab. So discussion about that. But his home is in the city of Samaria, and he's the Samaritan leader. And he is very much opposed to them rebuilding Jerusalem because it would be a challenge to his power. Josephus records him later in history. So if you're ever reading through Josephus and you see his name, Josephus is probably talking about either the second or the third. So this is not who Josephus is talking about in his Jewish histories. So he's the most important bad guy. He's the big villain, right? In TV shows, we call him the big bad, right? He's the one who's the biggest enemy. And his partner in crime here is Tobiah the Ammonite. Been a lot of discussion about him as well. He probably was not a leader of Ammon. He was probably also a Samaritan. That term Ammonite is probably having to do with his history. But we don't really know, but that's just his name, right? Tobiah the Ammonite, and he is an enemy, but he is very much a close relative too. And so these guys are very much opposed to the rebuilding and to the identity of God's people living in Jerusalem, right? Because we fail to remember sometimes that the nation that belonged to God pre-exile was very small. As a matter of fact, how many tribes were loyal to God at the end? Just two. Which ones were they? Judah and Benjamin, right? So everybody else, when they're conquered by the Assyrian Empire, they become something else, right? They intermarry, they intersperse, and they no longer are God's people. And so we need to remember these guys, along with Geshem, the Arab, who we'll talk about in a little while. Yes.
I think it's interesting, especially with the Ammonites. I don't know about the Horonite or whatever, but the Ammonites, weren't they descendants of Lot?
Yes.
So it's a similar relationship that they had with the Edomites. It was just a very bad history between the two. And here's these relatives of the people who are supposed to be, showing them love, but it's a bad history.
Yeah. But now let's not forget, do you remember when these people asked Ezra if they could be part of rebuilding the temple? What was Ezra's answer to them? Nope. You're not part of us, right? And so, this history, we could trace the Jew and Samaritan rivalry all the way back to the book of Kings, right? You talked about the Edomites. Well, that's where the problem happens, right? The Edomites don't help when they're being conquered and destroyed, right? And so by the time we get over to the New Testament, right, in the book of Luke, and we read that Jews and Samaritans won't even walk on the same side of the road, this is all part of the same history. Chapter 3. I don't know how well you can see that on your little paper there, that little drawing. It would have been bigger on the TV, but I'm going to try to find us next week a better picture of this. I found one that was really good, but I couldn't figure out how to buy it and had watermarks all over it. But we will. But chapter 3 talks about all the different gates. All the different gates in the book of Nehemiah. You have a picture in your Bible with it? Yeah. Nice. And so it's the same picture, really? No, it's better. Oh, okay. And so this gives you a picture kind of what it would have looked like and what the different gates were. And I'll try to have you a better picture next week and see what it talks about. But chapter 3 talks about those gates and who rebuilt them and all the things that went along with that.
Jeremy, are you talking about this picture, this one?
Yes, that you probably can't see.
Chapter 2?
Yes, picture that you probably can't see.
But it is chapter 3?
Yes, it is. It is a summary of those things in chapter 3. Yes. All right, let's get back into our text here. My favorite one, by the way, is the dung gate. I don't know why that cracks me up, but it does. The dung gate. That's the one that Barry would go through, the dung gate. All right, let's turn over to chapter 4 really quickly. We're moving fast because we have to. It's only a 7-week course, so But chapter 4, one of the most important verses, one of the most important chapters in this whole thing. And so, of course, there's opposition and there's anger. In verse 2, in the presence and the associates of the army of Samaria, he said, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are? And then Tobiah, the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, what are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones. Right? So they're being picked on here, right? Pretty mercilessly, but it's going to be more than that. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. Remember when we were studying Psalms on Sunday morning, we talked about imprecatory Psalms, calling down curses? That's what Nehemiah is doing here. So verse 6. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. What's the difference, I guess, in your understanding in where it says that they had a mind to work versus they worked with all their heart? I'm interested to hear your opinions.
I think a mind to work means that they use their mind on how to build the wall correctly. With all of their heart was that they still use their mind, they still tried to build it correctly, but they had a different feeling for building it. It wasn't that they were looking for perfection for the sake of perfection. They were looking for perfection to honor God.
Yeah. So when we think about mind, we think about the intellect. When we think about heart, we think about emotions. What we fail to realize, though, sometimes is that those things are often synonymous as it relates to the biblical understanding, right? So this whole year we're talking about heart, and the Hebrew word there and the Aramaic are more having to do with heart than they are mind. This is the same word that's used when it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And this is the word for heart that's used over and over in the Old Testament. They worked with all of their heart. But I think it's the same concept, right? That they put their mind to something, right? When you put your mind to something, you can accomplish it, right? If you're sitting at the computer at work and you're just sort of mindlessly sitting there, that's one thing. But if you have your mind focused on something, you can get something done a lot quicker, right? This happened to me today. I was kind of sitting at my computer thinking about all the things that are going on this week, thinking about class tonight, and I got a reminder that I was supposed to be making a flyer for the Ladies' Day. I'd promised to do that. And so I pulled up the flyer and sat and started. And before I knew it, just a few minutes, hey, the flyer was done, right? Because I focused in on it, right? That's something we do. But I think this is more than that. It's more than focus. It is and I think the way you said it is right. It was a dedication and a complete and total submission to get this done because of what it stood for, rebuilding the city of God. And so he said the people had a mind to work. The people worked with all of their heart. And so we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. So I think that's a really powerful verse. Certainly, there is a lesson to be had out of there that most of you have probably heard about church growth, that if we want the church to grow, we have to work with all of our heart and we have a mind to work. But here he's talking about the rebuilding of the walls. Thoughts on any of that? Yes, ma'am. Somebody have a hand up? Oh, yes.
Mine says that they had the will to keep working. I don't know if that
Oh.
plays into
Yeah, the will to keep working. That's a combination of the heart and the mind. What version is that? CSB. I like the CSB. I'm a big fan of it. I almost bought a CSB the other day from James Barr, but the Bible is so big that it's hard for me to carry. So I don't think I can use that one. But for some of you people that can't read, Grammy, because your eyesight is bad, that would have been a good Bible to have because the letters are about that big in it. But So the idea of mind and heart. So I want to look at two more things here. We're going to finish up. We've been going for over an hour straight already, and so we're going to wrap up here in just a few minutes. But let's read here, Spencer. If you don't care, I'm tired of reading. If you'll read verses 7 through 14 for us, and then we'll look there at something.
Now when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and that the breaches began to be closed, they were very angry. So all of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause confusion in it. How far did you take it over?
2:14.
Okay. But we prayed to our God, and because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night. And so in Judah it was said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing. Yet there is much trouble, and we ourselves are unable to rebuild the wall. And our enemies said, they will not know or see until we come among them, kill them, and put a stop to the work. When the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times, they will come up against us from every place where you may turn.
Okay, pause right there for a second. So I think this is a very common thing that happens, right? So the people had a mind to work. The people were focused. They had the will to get it finished. But then all the threats from outside came, and then they said, what? We can't do it. It makes me think of Numbers chapter 13 when it says that the spies said that we were like grasshoppers in their sight, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, right? They said, we can't do it. Our enemies are there. They'll kill us. They'll end the work. And so this is where you need leadership. When people are discouraged, when their hearts are failing, this is when leaders step up. And here Nehemiah does. Read 13 and 14.
Then I stationed men in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, the exposed places, and I stationed the people in families with their swords, spears, and bows. When I saw their fear, I stood and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, not be afraid of them. Remember, the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses.
Yeah, man, I love that. He says there, don't be scared, don't be afraid, but fight. Not just for yourself, but fight for your families, for your wives, for your sons and your daughters. Remember what we're doing. I think when we think about relevance to our modern world, and there's a reason, by the way, that preachers love Nehemiah chapter 4. It says that we have to fight. Certainly, there's relevance to the modern world in that when we are trying to fight for standing for what's right, fight for spiritual things, we have to make sure that we have that same fight in us to stand up for what's right. And that's a really important verse, the verse I have highlighted in my Bible, and I hope you will as well. And so the result of that is this. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. And here I love the balance that they strike. From that day on, verse 16, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. This is the balance of life, right? Work with one hand, fight off the enemy with the other. We talked about the book of Job last night here in our sermon. And that was like 24 hours ago. It's been a long 24 hours. But, that balance between doing what's right and fighting off the enemy, that the enemy is real. It's not the Arabs or the Ammonites or the Ashdodites here, but our enemy, our adversary, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And so we're fighting him off. We're fighting the world off, while on the other side, encouraging our brethren, working. It's the same balance that exists in our churches between edification and evangelism, right? Those are two sides of the same coin, building each other up while still reaching out to others. It's this same balance and this same thought process here in Nehemiah chapter 4, in verse 18. Let's finish out the chapter. I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we're widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. our God will fight for us. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. That time, I also said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night so they can serve us as guards by night and workers by day. Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when we went for water. And so here, they dedicate themselves to rebuilding the city walls. And so we get a good glimpse here into who Nehemiah was and what his mission was. Now, here's where we're going. Nehemiah, you may be well aware, is 13 chapters. So we haven't quite made it to the halfway point. Chapter 5 is one episode where Nehemiah scolds them for taking advantage of people financially. He helps the poor. And then we go back to the building project. And then we're going to look at some more things in the rest of the chapter. And then we'll close out in chapter 13 looking at the final reforms of Nehemiah. So here's the goal. Next week, we will maybe not completely finish Nehemiah, but we'll get towards the end of it. And then we will spend a little bit of time looking at the last couple of weeks, looking at the book of Esther, and then we will be done. We have 3 more sessions after tonight to finish this. And it's a very interesting study. I love Esther as well, and so I want to make sure we give it its fair time. Questions, comments, thoughts? Y'all did good. Y'all all stayed awake for almost 70 minutes. Man, that's pretty good. Yeah, it's all those donuts and everything else. All righty. If you don't mind, as we close out, anybody have any last comments?
Jeremy, I just think it's a great picture of leadership. You know, he understood that to get the work done, he had to delegate.
Yeah.
And everybody had a role in that. That's a great message for us today. You know, I think of kind of the same situation with Jethro went to Moses, and Moses was just overwhelmed having to judge all the people. And he tells him you need help.
Yeah.
So, you know, we have to make sure we're not putting ourselves in a line and that everybody has a job in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Barry, how about closing us out in prayer?
Father in heaven, we are so thankful we can get together with other Christians and to be encouraged on our walk as we try to find our way to heaven when we leave this earth. Father, we're thankful for your word, that we can learn what you expect from us and what we can do to spend eternity with you. We thank you for Jared, for his ability to teach and preach and to just help us as we study your word. Thank you for the talents that you've given him. We thank you for each one that's here tonight, putting you first on Monday night. And we just pray that you would be with each of us, that we will do what you would have us to do. We thank you for our church here in LJ. We thank you for the encouragement and the love that we all have for one another. We pray that we know that we're human and that sometimes we get a little bit crossed up, and we pray that you would be with each of us, that we would all realize that we are on the same team and we're trying to get each one of us to heaven. Forgive us when we do those things that are wrong, and help us to bring someone to heaven with us. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen.
Oh.